As one of the biggest anti-war protests in Australian history dominated headlines, you might have got a very different story depending on which news outlet you visited. Police, organisers, and the protesters themselves all had different stories to tell. And this massive moment of public expression came as protest laws around the country are being increasingly toughened. But do Australians have a right to protest? And do they make an impact? Today, I'm talking to editor Lenore Taylor and head of Newsroom Mike Ticher about the politics of public protest. Good morning, Lenore.
Morning, Bridie.
I'm back.
She's back.
Good morning, Mike.
Welcome back, Bridie. Hi.
Thank you. Hundreds of thousands of people marched across the Sydney Harbour Bridge on the weekend to protest the Israel government's actions in Gaza. But depending on which news outlet you read, you might have a different understanding of how that event unfolded. Why did the coverage vary so much?
Well, it certainly did vary. I mean, when we looked at what was happening at a protest that big, so much bigger than anticipated, even by the organisers, at a protest where there was clearly people from all walks of life, parents, old people, young people, like lots of people who probably hadn't participated in the protests that have been happening every week since October 7, just looked at the sheer volume of people and the things that people were saying when they were going across the bridge. We saw it as an historic moment, as a real moment of people power, of ordinary citizens voicing their views about something in the torrential rain. Like there couldn't have been a worse day to walk across the bridge, and yet everybody came. I think other publications, particularly News Corp publications, have really taken a view more informed by the views of the Jewish community or parts of the Jewish community, for whom, understandably, the events of October 7 are still a source of great trauma and fear, and who feel very concerned about that kind of a showing of public support. So I think that's sort of the real divide in the coverage. But I think certainly the Sydney Morning Herald and the ABC saw it like we did. And I don't see how you could see it as anything other than an amazing response by Sydney-siders to what they're seeing on their news happening in Gaza every night, the starvation, what's happening to children. You know, it clearly, to my mind, it clearly was a moment.
When there are that many people, there are always going to be multitudes of points of view among the people who go there. There are going to be people coming from all kinds of different backgrounds, and some will have views that others on the same march might find deeply offensive. But I think from a news point of view, it was the difference between the weekly marches that have been happening for the past 2 years, basically, and this particular march, not partly because of the venue and also because of the horrendous images that have been publicised around the world in the past weeks, that brought a completely different set of people to the march who hadn't previously been involved in public protest. And that's the news point, I think, to me, that it was a wide variety of people, but it was like a whole lot of new people coming to say, actually, things have changed. We really have to want to say something now. And I think regardless of whether you agree with that or not, that's the newsworthy part of it.
It's what happened.
To a large extent, that this is something different. This is something new.
But I think, as Mike says, there are always going to be a variety of views. Tens of thousands, 100,000, 200,000 people are not all going to be thinking exactly the same thing or having exactly the same motivations for marching. And I know some of the coverage that was sort of trying to portray the march in a certain way really focused in heavily on a single protester who was holding up an image of Iran's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, that did happen. That was there. But it was also one person. So I guess in our coverage, we tried really hard to send a number of reporters, talk to as many people as we could, and distill what we thought the general feeling at the march was. Now, that's not a scientific process. You can't know for sure, but I don't think that one person holding up that image was representative of the majority of marchers. I think from what we could tell, the majority of marchers had just had enough of what they were seeing on the news, and they wanted to make their voice heard that governments needed to do everything they could to apply pressure to make it stop.
I mean, The Australian, in its editorial, said that those pictures raised questions about how supposedly liberal protesters can endorse the theocracy's cruel treatment of women, etc. The sins of Iran. I don't think people on the march were endorsing the cruel theocracy of Iran as a general rule. That's not what people were there for.
And you've both referenced the size of this march, which did become a point of contention over the few days after it. How do we work out how many people were on that bridge?
I mean, we can't scientifically. Obviously, the police made their own estimate. They said it was about 90,000. The organisers said it was many more.
We did have a shot at it.
We had a go at it, but even that estimate, even the expert we asked, the main person we asked to estimate it, came up with a figure that had a wide parameters.
A large margin of error.
A large margin of error.
But I mean, which was 230,000 to 300,000.
Yeah, but I mean, even if, okay, so maybe 200,000, maybe 180,000, a lot of people.
And in the lead up to the march, Chris Minns was quite critical of that protest happening, and he is facing a backlash in the wake of it from within his own government as well. Why do you think he misread the public sentiment in that way?
I don't know what's going on in his mind. I think he has been understandably concerned about anti-Semitic incidents in New South Wales. I think he was criticised because of the protests that happened at the Opera House straight after October 7 and what a small number of people at those protests were saying, which was anti-Semitic. But I think he really misjudged the public mood on this one. I think he was trying to stop it, and even when it went ahead, he looked begrudging. He didn't seem to really understand what a large number of people in Sydney and Greater Sydney, like people came from far and wide for this much, were trying to tell him.
But obviously things have changed a lot since then. This is nearly 2 years ago now, and there have been many, many events since that have massively changed the atmosphere, and this was in no way a comparable event, I don't think, to those ones, but he still seemed to be in that same mindset.
But he also seemed to misjudge the mood of his own party, so there was a lot of dissent within his own party when he was trying to stop the march. And then when it did go ahead, 2 of his ministers and many of his backbenchers actually marched. So, and then afterwards there was, still anger in his own party room about the way the government had handled it. So I think he misjudged the mood of Sydney and he misjudged the mood of his own party.
There's also been a bit of history around protest generally, where New South Wales has been the state that has tried to pass legislation most frequently to restrict the rights to protest, previously much more to do with environmental protests than Palestine. But I think it's fair to say the previous coalition government and the current Labor government have not been animated by sort of a thoroughgoing commitment to free speech.
Freedom of expression?
Freedom of expression, as opposed to, peace on the streets, peace on the waters, peace, people not blocking railways, not blocking freeways, etc., when they're trying to protest. And that does come into conflict with freedom of expression. And when it came to this one, I think the public mood was very much for, we want to have our say on this, not
what about the traffic?
More concerned about the traffic, exactly.
Well, you are referencing laws. There were laws introduced as recently as earlier this year that were stricter about protest. What exactly is the state of play in New South Wales when it comes to the law and protest?
Well, I think you need to go back to the state of play in Australia in general. So there's no explicit right to protest, but the High Court has interpreted the Constitution to imply a freedom of expression. And I think most people would think that they had a right to make their voice known, but actually that's not an explicit legislative right. Over the years, various governments, state and federal, have tried to sort of eat away at that right, that implied right to freedom of expressions in various ways. As Mike referenced there, after the climate protests in New South Wales, there were laws passed which criminalised disruption on roads, like a sort of traffic related way of bringing things in. After some of the pro-Palestine protests, there was the ability given to issue a move-on order if a protest was happening outside of a place of worship, like a synagogue. That is facing a constitutional challenge from the Palestine Action Group. So I think there's been this sort of constant attempt to erode Australians' right to protest through various guises. And the upshot of that has been to make the law a bit vague in a way, a bit vague and a bit hard to figure out what you are and aren't allowed to do. If you are a would-be protester and you want to do it lawfully, it is going to be sometimes hard to figure out what you can and can't do.
particularly in that recent one in relation to places of worship, where the wording in the legislation is near a place of worship, which is undefined. That's obviously
Which
can
could be town
interpreted
hall.
in many ways.
Chris Minns also said, I thought sort of churlishly, like, you can't do this every week. We can't have a protest on the bridge every week. Like, no one's suggesting that there should be a protest on the bridge every week. And when there is a protest on the bridge, it really is generally a moment in Sydney's history and Australia's history. There was the Reconciliation March. I can remember going on it with my 2-year-old son on my shoulders. God help me if I tried to do that now. There was the Pride March. There was this march. I mean, they are big moments. I guess to give him due, he may be thinking about, well, if the court can overturn it, what does that mean, and about frequency and cost and stuff. I mean, I don't really think it's a problem, but maybe that's what he's thinking about.
But the protest almost didn't go ahead as well, we have to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's right. Initially, the police said it shouldn't go ahead. They hadn't had enough time to prepare for public safety, etc. Protesters can apply for an order, going back to what I said about it being a bit vague and hard to navigate. They can apply for an order, a notice of intention to hold a public assembly, which is sometimes called a Form 1 process. And that means that they have some protection from being arrested or moved on by those other laws. The police said no in this instance. They appealed it to the Supreme Court, looking for a prohibition order, looking to stop this march from happening. And the Supreme Court Justice Belinda Riggs said, in the end, the protesters had compellingly explained the reasons why it was urgent, and she allowed it to happen. And that earned her a whole lot of criticism, but that's really what forced the march's ability to go ahead against the will of the New South Wales government and the police.
And part of that criticism included even former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. He posted on X, "It should not be for judges to decide when a political protest is justified." So who should be deciding when a political protest is justified?
The judge was trying to apply the law.
Her job.
She didn't have to take the politics of the protest into account. What she did take into account was what she said was the public interest in freedom of expression at this time in the manner contemplated for the reasons advanced is very high. What that means is people have strong feelings about this issue, whatever it may be. A lot of people apparently want to take part in this protest, as proved to be the case. Therefore, the public interest in freedom of expression takes precedence over other considerations. I think that is for judges to rule on. It's for politicians to make the law and judges to apply it. Generally, that's the system we have.
And if they don't like how it's happening, then they can change the law. And there are now various ideas floating around about how the law in New South Wales might be changed in response to all of this, but she was doing her job. I think the other thing that is really interesting is how people's views of whether protesting is a good or bad thing per se change depending on what the protest is about and whether they agree with them. So I remember in 2011 there was a convoy of no confidence to Canberra. A whole bunch of a couple of hundred trucks came to Canberra to protest against the Labor government and the carbon tax. And Tony Abbott actually joined that protest outside of Canberra, and then he spoke to it. And, it was also a protest that had the potential to disrupt traffic and all the things that people were worried about in this case, and it wasn't nearly as big. But he joined it on the way into Canberra, and he said that the protesters were salt of the earth Australians who feel they are being ripped off by a bad government. And in his speech in front of Parliament, he said that the fact that so many of you have come so far shows you care a great deal about the future of our country. And he'd also earlier that year appeared in the very famous Ditch the Witch protest outside of Canberra. So, I think when voicing an opinion on whether protests should or shouldn't go ahead, it's really helpful to think about how you'd feel if the protest was something you disagreed with or something that you agreed with, and see whether your opinion changed.
And I mean, that's a question for all sides of politics is to balance the freedom of expression against what you may think are the obnoxiousness of the views being expressed. I mean, there are laws against some kinds of, you can't hold signs supporting a prescribed terrorist organisation, for example. In some states there are rules about Nazi insignia and so on, rightly so. But if the protesters don't breach any of those laws, then if you actually believe in freedom of expression, then you should be upholding their right to say things that you don't agree with. That's kind of the point. state that we sometimes think we live in.
Well, I think Tony Abbott did say it pretty well in 2011. So thanks for finding that, Lenore. Has this protest changed anything?
Well, as I said, there's various ideas around about whether the law needs to change. I think the New South Wales opposition had a sort of piece of a private member's bill saying that maybe protesters should only allowed to have a certain number of protests and then they have to pay for the disruption. I think there's no way the government's going to let that one go anywhere. But the government itself is saying, do they need to change the law to clarify this this idea of, whether the Supreme Court can overturn what the police want to do. So there's that. I hope it has the number of people who turned out has focused their minds on the fact that people have expressed a view. Maybe they could think back to the long history in Australia of protests against the Franklin Dam or the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or many, and think about how they're viewed in retrospect compared with how they're viewed at the time. But if it has had an impact, and I think it has, I think mostly it is in the sense that it is one more thing intensifying pressure on our government to intensify pressure on the Israeli government. So it's not a direct effect, but in an indirect way, it is contributing to an international push that is really intensifying pressure on the Israeli government.
It showed that the people who care about this issue are not just activists or people with a direct family relation to the conflict or, a religious connection to the conflict or anything like that, but a much broader swathe of the population who just have been absolutely horrified by the scenes they're seeing.
And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Lenore, what was that for you?
For me, it has to be a whole series of articles that we have been running called The Descendants. They are incredibly compelling, horrific, interesting stories about massacres of Indigenous people and how the descendants of the groups who were the victims of the massacres and the descendants of the perpetrators of the massacres are now coming together to talk about and acknowledge and remember what happened. Beautifully written, incredibly researched. It's an amazing piece of work by Lorena Allam, who was our former Indigenous Affairs editor and is now the industry professor of Indigenous media at Jumbunna Institute at UTS, and our two Indigenous reporters, Sarah Collard and Ella Archibald-Binge. I can't really do it justice in this time, but it is an amazing piece of work. I would really encourage listeners to read those articles.
Oh, it's incredible journalism, but it's also an amazing reader experience on desktop as well as on the phone.
I should mention one of the articles shows a settler diary where the references to massacres were written in code, and we have deciphered the code, which is, quite interesting.
And Mike, what could you not get out of your head this week?
So my attention has been diverted by the unbelievable events in the US state of Texas. Basically, the state legislature has been trying to, under advice, perhaps that's the wrong word, from the president, has been trying to redraw the boundaries of the state legislature in Texas to provide for 5 new Republican Congress people ahead of the 2026 midterms in a blatant case of gerrymandering.
That's the word.
Which I found the origin of that word while I was looking at this, which is very interesting. Yeah. To try to forestall this, the Democrat members of the legislature have left the state because that would leave the legislature without the required quorum to pass the legislation. This can't go on forever. This may well have been overtaken by events even before this podcast goes out. But as the things stand at the moment, a large number of the Democrats are in other states, including the freedom-loving state of Illinois. Well, one of the most disturbing elements of this whole situation was that Democrat governors in Democrat-run states, including Gavin Newsom in California and Kathy Hochul in New York, have intimated that to counter this, if this goes through, they may have to row back on the way that independent commissions have been set up in those states to decide the boundaries, as we do in Australia with the Electoral Commission after the census every 10 years, and they would draw their own boundaries to favour Democrats being elected, to allow more Democrats to be elected in their states in a kind of tit-for-tat process, which would just lead to, well, what would it lead to? I don't know. Just
another glorious week in the American democracy.
A horrendous perversion of democracy all around.
I know about gerrymanders because I grew up in Queensland. Joh Bjelke-Petersen had nothing on this.
Yeah.
It's also the rabbit hole I've already planned to fall down this weekend
Yeah,
because there's so much reading
I'm on all
to
the
do.
podcasts.
Thank you so much for joining me this week, Mike.
Thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Lenore.
Thanks, Bridie.